All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're tackling a name that has literally echoed through the centuries. I mean, the guy's name has basically become synonymous with predicting the future. We're talking, of course, about Nostradamus. His enduring legacy is absolutely monumental. You've probably seen his name pop up in the media pretty much every single time there's a major global catastrophe. But today we're going to peel back the layers of this myth. We're using documented historical facts to demystify the actual man behind the legend.
So you gotta wonder, did a 16th century French apothecary genuinely possess some sort of supernatural ability to foresee the atomic bomb, the rise of Adolf Hitler, or the September 11 attacks? I mean, these are massive claims, right? And they're championed heavily by his modern supporters. But as you'll see in just a moment, when we actually look closely at the evidence, the reality of how these so-called predictions were formed is going to challenge everything you might think you know about his foresight.
Section 1. The Prophet of Doom.
To really understand this myth, we first have to look at the sheer scale of his claims, 942. That is the total number of poetic quatrains published in his famous 1555 book, Les Prophéties. Now, a quatrain is just a four-line poem, but by churning out 942 of these highly vague, loosely translated, and undated verses, Nostradamus essentially handed humanity a massive, sprawling volume of ambiguous text. And honestly, this sheer volume is exactly what allows people to constantly hunt for and supposedly find modern meaning hidden in his words.
It's exactly that massive volume of ambiguity that allowed the myth to take root and spread like wildfire. Enthusiasts have pointed to these vague quatrains to credit him with foreseeing the Great Fire of London, the French Revolution, the World Wars, you name it, virtually every historical tragedy in between. The popular press loves to rehash these claims whenever a new disaster strikes, painting him as this infallible seer. But to understand how these verses actually came to be, we really need to look at the guy who wrote them.
Section 2. Apothecary to astrologer. When we contrast the grand legends with the documented historical reality, a vastly different story emerges. Over the centuries, all these wild, apocryphal myths have sprung up, like the idea that he descended from some mystic Israelite lineage, or that he successfully cured the bubonic plague. But the actual documents tell us a vastly different story. He definitely didn't cure the plague. In fact, tragically, he lost his first wife and 2 children to it. His treatments, like his famous rose pill, were largely ineffective. And rather than being some esteemed academic, he was actually expelled from the University of Montpellier. Yeah, they kicked him out when they found out he was working as a lowly apothecary, which was a manual trade strictly forbidden by the university's rules.
This timeline really grounds him as a very mortal, unmagical man. Born in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in 1503, expelled from university in 1529, he didn't even publish Les Prophéties until 1555, pretty late in his life, and he died in 1566, not in some magical ascension, but of edema, which was brought on by years of suffering from severe, painful gout. He was just a regular guy, living a highly regular life in 16th century France.
So how in the world did he become the famous prophet we know today? Well, after those medical failures and facing the harsh realities of the era, Nostradamus made a pretty brilliant career pivot. He noticed a massive popular trend and just started writing annual astrological almanacs. And they were a huge hit. The nobility and the wealthy elite suddenly began paying him for psychic advice and horoscopes. He basically found a highly lucrative side hustle simply because his medical career had stalled out.
Let's move on to Section 3. Copying the ancients.
Okay, so once he was in the prophecy business, he obviously needed material. But here is the absolute ultimate twist. Check out this quote from his own 1555 times preface to Caesar. Nostradamus himself explicitly denied having his own supernatural prophetic powers. He literally wrote, "Not that I would attribute to myself either the name or the role of a prophet." And he said similar things in his letters to the King of France. So if he wasn't claiming to be a magical seer, where exactly was he getting his visions of the future?
Well, he wasn't having visions, he was reading. Modern researchers have dug up his actual bibliography, and it turns out he essentially just paraphrased classical historians like Livy, Suetonius, and Plutarch. He lifted his astrological calculations heavily from a writer named Richard Rousseau. And most importantly, he borrowed heavily from the Mirabilis Liber, which was a super popular 1522 collection of end-of-the-world prophecies. So he wasn't really seeing the future, he was essentially a compiler of ancient history and older doom-mongering texts.
And how exactly did he stitch all this together? Well, modern research suggests he definitely wasn't staring into a bowl of water in a deep trance like the legends say. Instead, he used a technique called bibliomancy. He would randomly open up these history books, pick an event that had already happened to the ancient Romans or Greeks, and then just project it forward using astrology, writing it down as a future prophecy. He was quite literally recycling the past.
Now, to get away with this in the 16th century without being accused of plagiarism or worse, angering the powerful religious authorities, Nostradamus deliberately made his writing incredibly confusing. He mixed French with Latin, Greek, and Provençal. He used incredibly complex word games and just intense vagueness. He intentionally created an obscure puzzle, and ironically, it's exactly this vagueness that allowed his verses to survive and be entirely twisted by others centuries later.
Which brings us to Section 4, Weaponizing Prophecy in WWW. Fast forward to the 20th century, and this intense vagueness became a highly calculated tool for political warfare. In 1940, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, discovered the psychological power of these ambiguous verses. His wife had actually shown him a book claiming Nostradamus had predicted a crisis in Poland. Goebbels immediately realized that people were genuinely terrified, and he could use the myth of the Great Prophet to demoralize Germany's enemies by making a Nazi victory seem fated or preordained.
What followed was an absolutely bizarre campaign of psychological warfare. Goebbels hired a Swiss astrologer to write fake Nostradamus booklets predicting German success, which the Luftwaffe literally airdropped over Belgium and France. But the Allies fought back using the exact same tactic. They dropped their own counter-propaganda pamphlets over occupied Europe, claiming Nostradamus actually predicted the Allies would win. MGM in America even made short films to boost public morale using the prophet's name. It was wild.
Consider this highly specific, terrifying quote regarding the Crooked Cross and 1,000 years. It sounds chillingly accurate, doesn't it? Well, Nostradamus did not write a single word of this. This passage was entirely forged by Goebbels' propaganda team. They printed it on genuine parchment using Gothic script just to make it look 400 years old, weaponizing history to spread fear.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that these governments were utilizing black propaganda. Neither the Axis nor the Allies actually believed in the occult or that a 16th century apothecary had seen the future. Not at all. They were just impartially leveraging a really famous myth. They used the public's deep anxiety and natural superstition as a highly calculated weapon of war.
And finally, Section 5, Retroactive Clairvoyance. So you might be asking, why do normal, everyday people still believe these myths today? The answer lies in a fascinating psychological process called retroactive clairvoyance, which is also known as post-diction. This is the act of taking incredibly vague, undated poetic words and forcing them to fit events that have already occurred. Think about it. No one has ever used Nostradamus to successfully predict a specific event before it happened. It's always after the tragedy occurs that people rush back to the book, find a vague verse about a fire in a big city, and claim he saw it coming all along.
And to make matters even worse, as scholars have pointed out, a lot of these modern hits rely on terribly poor, tendentious English translations. Modern translators will often take that original 16th century French and intentionally manipulate the words to force a better fit with modern tragedies. They are effectively rewriting the prophecies in hindsight, just to make the myth look real.
And what about the end of the world? People love to claim Nostradamus predicted the apocalypse on a specific date. Well, in his preface, Nostradamus himself claimed his prophecies extended to the year 3797. Why that specific strange year? It definitely wasn't a vision. He literally just subtracted the year he was writing, 1555, from the year 2242, which was a year that his astrological source, Richard Rossat, had proposed for the end of the world. It's literally just copied math. Ultimately, what Nostradamus left behind wasn't a map of the future. Not at all. The quatrains are essentially an endless canvas for human anxiety. Because they are so incredibly obscure and completely undated, they act as a mirror. Our brains have this innate desire for pattern recognition, you know? When we feel out of control, we look for order. We end up projecting our own current, modern fears right onto his 16th century poetry.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. If Nostradamus was really just copying old history books, why is humanity still so intensely eager to find prediction in the chaos of our world? Perhaps the enduring myth of Nostradamus isn't really about his ability to see the future at all. Perhaps it's a reflection of our deep psychological need to feel that someone, somewhere, actually knows what's going to happen next. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this helped clear the fog around the Prophet of Doom. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.